Good afternoon, and welcome to this week's Full Scottish on Broadcasting Scotland. As yesterday was International Women's Day, we will be discussing the week's top Scottish and international news through the lens. I'm Nadia, and we are lucky to be joined by two prominent women guests to give us their insights on these stories. Joyce McMillan is a journalist and commentator. She is the Scotsman's theatre critic and also writes a weekly political opinion column. Welcome, Joyce.
Hello.
And we welcome. I'd like to welcome Siobhan Tolland. Tolland is a writer and the SNP councillor for Lochee Ward and Dundee. Welcome, Siobhan.
Hiya.
So we start today's program with the Middle East update. At least 48,453 Palestinians have been killed and 111,860 wounded in Gaza since 7th of October 2023. With the ceasefire first phase agreement ended, the second phase talks stalled and Israel blocking humanitarian aid. There are concerns that Israel is ready to launch a fresh ground attack on Gaza. Now, I would like to go to Ukraine update. 1,110 of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Ukraine is fully committed to have a constructive dialogue with US representatives in Saudi Arabia next week over ways to end the war in Russia. Volodymyr Zelensky said on Saturday, Ukraine has been seeking peace from the very first second of this war. Realistic proposals are on the table. The key is to move quickly and effectively. The Ukrainian president said he would visit Saudi Arabia next week, and that after meeting with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman on Monday. Ukrainian diplomatic and military representatives would stay for a meeting on Tuesday with the US team. The Ukrainian delegation will include the Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha, Zelensky's Chief of Staff and Andriy Yermak, and the Defense Minister Rustem Umerov. Russia launched a devastating attack on Ukraine on Saturday, killing at least 14 people and injuring dozens more. 2 ballistic missiles hit the center of Dobropilya in eastern Donetsk region. Fire engulfed a 5-story apartment building as emergency services arrived. Russia launched another strike on the same area. 11 civilians were killed, with 5 children among the injured. 3 people were killed and 7 others were injured in drone attack early Saturday. And Ukraine's Air Force said the attacks came as Donald Trump said the Russian leader Vladimir Putin was doing what anybody would do. Speaking to reporters and in the Oval Office on Friday, the US president said he finds it easier to work with Russia than Ukraine and that Putin wants to end the war. President Zelensky has called for more sanctions on Russia in response to the attack. Such strikes show that Russia's objectives have not changed, he wrote on Facebook. Therefore, it is crucial to continue to do our best to protect lives, strengthen our air defenses, and increase sanctions against Russia. Everything that helps Putin finance the war must collapse. On Saturday, Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk said the appeasement towards Russia was leading to more tragedy in Ukraine. This is what happens when someone appeases barbarians, Tusk wrote on X. More bombs, more aggression, more victims, another tragic night in Ukraine. Russia's defense minister announced the recapture of Vikrotovka, Nikolaevka and Staraya Soroshina in its Kursk region, according to the Deep State on an online military tracker linked to the Ukrainian army. The Russian move followed a breach in the Ukrainian defense lines near the town of Zutsa, which is under Kiev's control. An army source interviewed by Ukrainska Pravda newspaper said that the Ukrainian soldiers were trying to stabilize the situation, but the Russian troops had completely cut off the supply lines. Moscow's defense minister on Saturday claimed it at air defenses and destroyed 31 Ukrainian drones over the previous night. A Ukrainian drone attack also targeted Russia's Cllr oil refinery. The governor of the northwestern Leningrad region, Alexander Drozdenko, said. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese said his country would consider taking part in a peacekeeping mission in Ukraine. The Australian leader spoke with Keir Starmer, who has joined France in trying to rally a coalition of the willing to protect any ceasefire in Russia-Ukraine war. Australia will send a senior representative to a Chiefs of Defence meeting in Paris on Tuesday to discuss future backing for Ukraine, Albanese said. So now we are going into our discussions about their defence and spending. Before going into our other discussions, I would like to ask about the news which I have read to Tolland and Miss Tolland and Joyce McMillan. So I'll ask Joyce. I hope my pronunciations were not right, but hope you were able to hear what I was saying. And would you like to add something into it?
It's not so much add something, but I guess kind of to comment on what's happening. I think the situation in Gaza is desperately concerning. The problem, I suppose, partly with the world now is that with intense 24/7 media, what you tend to get is a really strong focus on what is seen as the lead story of the day, and then less focus and less analysis of the other stories that are going on. And for the last couple of weeks, given Donald Trump's extraordinary behaviour over Ukraine, that has, and the scenes in the Oval Office last week, the focus of the media and of world international affairs analysts and so forth has been very much on that situation, and it is indeed a dramatic and very important situation. However, it's certainly not more important and certainly not more lethal than the situation in Gaza, which is shocking in that there's supposed to be a ceasefire going on. Israel was demanding, without any real justification, that the first phase of the ceasefire should continue, so that they could avoid moving on to the second phase, which would have involved a substantial withdrawal of Israeli troops from Gaza. And when that didn't happen, they just seem to have abandoned the ceasefire altogether. They've blocked all aid entering Gaza again, which means that once again the people of Gaza are at risk of serious food shortages and potential starvation. And it should be said that that's not a question of Israel sending food into Gaza. That's all of the world's aid to Gaza being blocked at the entry points by Israel in order to put pressure on Hamas and the people of Gaza. The solutions that have been proposed by Donald Trump and implicitly by Benjamin Netanyahu to the Gaza situation are plainly criminal. I mean, they involve the displacement of the entire population of Gaza and its redevelopment as a kind of American-Israeli colony along the lines that Trump has described as a sort of Dubai-style beach resort, the situation is desperate. I mean, there doesn't seem to be any capacity in the international community to do anything about it. It's not only Gaza, the situation's also deteriorating in the other occupied territories. The people of the West Bank have been put through sort of shocking series of raids and killings and so on in the last few weeks. Absolutely no real response from the international community at all. So, I think the situation in Gaza is really a desperate one. And the only source of hope I have really is in the sort of grace and resilience of a few of the people of Gaza that I follow online. Their determination to rebuild and to remain in their beautiful area there on the edge of the Mediterranean is absolutely astonishing. And, they really seem completely determined to build a better future there. And somewhere in that determination, there might be a little grain of hope. But, it's hard not to be constantly shocked and saddened by the situation there, by the obvious breaches of international law, by the failure of any serious attempt to maintain the ceasefire, by the violence and by the level of death, and particularly by its impact on the very large number of children in Gaza, is totally, totally heartbreaking.
Thank you, Joyce. And Siobhan,
Yeah, thanks, Nadia. I couldn't agree more with what Joyce was saying there, so I'm not going to echo that. I think, it's becoming increasingly difficult to separate the issue in Gaza with the issue in Ukraine as well. I always felt that the situation in Gaza, that kind of genocide that was occurring there, was almost a test case in how far we could break the international law of human rights. And it seems rather depressingly and fearfully that those human rights were very, very easy to break. Of course, the election of Donald Trump has completely fragmented our traditional laws and structures on human rights, amongst many other issues, and I'm sure we'll get to those later on in the programme. But the international statutes, that international morality, if you will, is suddenly crumbling and has been crumbling in Gaza. Joyce is absolutely right. All humanitarian aid is now blocked. That's not a ceasefire. A ceasefire does not include death by starvation, and that's what's happening. It's not just food, it's medical aid and assistance as well. So there really is a massive push there. The issue we have, of course, is why on earth would Israel stick to the ceasefire when the actions of Donald Trump has been clearly threatening the people of Gaza, to literally, they don't even need to kind of tumble over because 90% of homes are now damaged or destroyed, but to turn Gaza into some disgusting playground that Donald Trump has suggested. So the threat there of forced displacement is there, which allows Netanyahu to pretty much do what he wants. And this brings me on to Ukraine as well, because the strategy is actually very similar, because what we've got, and we saw those scenes last Friday in the White House, in the Oval Office, of what actually happened there. It was a case of just straightforward bullying and straightforward kind of almost gangsterism by threatening Ukraine with, well, I mean, they've already withdrew military aid, they've withdrew intelligence for Ukraine to prevent them from protecting themselves, therefore allowing Russia more power and more emboldenment in terms of that occupation of Ukraine. The strategies are actually very similar, and Donald Trump seems to be that common denominator in that. We are living in very, very different times now. The rules have suddenly changed across the board, and we're all having to rethink and reset what our moral grounds might be, and that we'll probably get to that in a wee bit as well. But those are massive international issues that we now have to consider. The situation in Gaza, as Joyce said, it was almost just glossed over because we were caught up. And I say drama, but it was a drama, and that's a terrible thing to say, but Donald Trump turned it into a drama. Yes. He said that the Oval Office ambush of Zelensky, that this made great television. He's turning these things into a drama, and we're not seeing the bigger humanitarian picture.
Yeah. Joyce, on that drama comment, do you think it was a big distraction about Gaza, what happened or happens in the Oval Office? And I know it's a very big thing, and Ukraine war and Gaza ceasefire and everything, they are dramatizing, and so the media attention will go into that, still people over there in that war-torn places, they are suffering. And can you please comment on that?
Yes, well, I mean, it's extremely difficult. Obviously, news bulletins aren't, if you're talking about mainstream broadcast news, which is how most people get their news, and the internet, of course, which still tends to piggyback on that sort of mainstream news. Yes, of course, a thing like the events last week in the Oval Office will distract attention from Gaza. And I have to say, it looks very much to me as if the Netanyahu government, which has already shown repeatedly its complete disregard for any notion of international law or legality and so on. I mean, there isn't a warrant out for Netanyahu from the International Criminal Court, which sadly very few countries appear willing to act on. Yes, I mean, he's just taken that opportunity while the attention of the world is elsewhere to step up Israel's aggression towards the West Bank and Gaza. It hasn't had the attention it's deserved. It has had some attention, though. I mean, there are many, many people who are very committed to the campaign to support the people of Gaza. And it's not as if the debate in the West is over or anything like it. There's huge popular unrest. I mean, we saw those scenes in London yesterday when that guy climbed up Big Ben and wouldn't come down, waving a Palestinian flag and demanding attention for the situation in Gaza. We saw the scenes at the Trump golf resort in Ayrshire, where people broke in there, painted up the golfing greens and splashed red paint all over the front of the lovely white building, So, I mean, it's not as if the issue of Gaza and Palestine is going to go away. There are many, many people across the West who are completely committed to the cause of supporting them. But in terms of the wider media agenda and people who are too busy to be activists, people who just aren't involved in politics to that extent, yes, of course, the attention shifts from one to the other and back again, depending on where the highest drama is happening at any given moment. And, one wishes it wasn't so, and one wishes that news organisations nowadays had more resources to put into situations like this so that they could make the kind of connections that Siobhan's just drawn, because obviously the collapse of what they used to call the rule-governed international order is the common factor between these two situations. But of course, one of the truths about that is that the West has been allowing the rule-governed international order to collapse in relation to Israel for decades, and so really has not got much of a moral leg to stand on when it comes to trying to defend it now.
Among my updates, like the Ukrainian update, Siobhan, would you like to comment on that? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Sorry, I might have to move on to the next because we are running out of time. The defense spending is the next topic which we would like to discuss. And when even a former Tory defense secretary is warning that US support to maintain the UK's nuclear arsenal is in doubt. Should the UK spend money developing its own independent nuclear weapons, buy from France, or instead concentrate on rebuilding conventional forces, modern equipment and cyber defenses? Siobhan.
Quite a lot to unpack there, and something that I kind of mentioned earlier on, that we are kind of sitting in a massive shift now in terms of the world order, and how we saw the world is completely different from what we see it now, even just a couple of weeks almost later. But yes, there's a couple of issues there. The first one really, I think, is our relationship to the US, what that was, what that looks like now, and what that might look like sometime in the future. We can no longer, I think, rely on the US as any kind of friendship, any kind of back-in. Their threats to pull out of NATO causes problems for kind of defence across the Western world, and actually, and this comes back to the Ukraine situation, Donald Trump and the US's diktats on Ukraine means that the European Union and the European countries have to really rethink how we move forward in terms of the defence of Europe, the defence of Ukraine, because they're both obviously connected together. To defend Ukraine is also to defend Europe. And I think that thankfully, that line, I think, is certainly been promoted across the European Union, if not in the US. In terms of defence spending, I am absolutely anti-nuclear, and I know that there's been some discussion, not well within the SNP, but also at the SNP, I suppose, in terms of should we rethink our nuclear policy. In terms of that, I would say to that, absolutely not, because I think that we get into this escalation of war. We get into this big aggressive man thinking, which we see in people like Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, that somehow peace will come from arming ourselves more and more and more with more destructive weapons. And we'll probably get to a women-centred approach later on as well in terms of peace. But actually what we have there is an escalation of violence and an escalation of a threat of violence rather than a de-escalation of that. We don't solve the world's problems by arming ourselves to the hilt. We recognise this in the 80s with mutually assured destruction. Mad. It was an absolute ridiculous period where we just threatened each other with nuclear arms. I think, however, we do probably need to rethink our defence spending, and I think that's not an argument that we would probably kind of have at this moment. I think it's maybe a given. How we fund that is entirely different. There's a couple of areas, of course, we can reduce our spending on nuclear weapons and move into conventional spending. But there's also another element as well. We could rejoin the EU and have a kind of a much more integrated approach, not just to our defence and our security, but also to our economy as well. And we'll probably get to that in a wee bit as well.
Yeah. My next question was actually, you touched upon that, Siobhan. How should this be funded? By cutting foreign aid, borrowing, or raising taxes? That's going to Joyce.
Sorry, Joyce.
Sorry, not by doing either of the things that Keir Starmer has done so far. Cutting foreign aid is exactly the opposite of how you should fund any increase in defence spending. If you're going under certain pressures to increase defence spending, then the absolutely critical thing in terms of foreign aid is to keep up that positive side of your international presence, the constructive side, the capacity building side, the side that supports people and helps them, rather than cutting it back. And the same goes, of course, for the cuts in social security that are being proposed at home now, which are equally indefensible.
Yeah. I think I'll leave it to that, and I'll move on with the next topic, women in conflict. Throughout history, women have played an important role in conflict, but when given the chance, have played a much more important role in conflict resolution. The Scottish Government announced the Women in Conflict's 1,325 Fellowship Programme will receive continued funding to train women peace builders from around the world in Scotland. First Minister John Swinney has reaffirmed Scotland's commitment to promoting women's leadership in conflict resolution. I'd like to discuss on that, and Siobhan, if that's okay.
Yes, I mean, I think it's a great initiative, and the funding is more than welcome. I think, especially given these very intense and fearful, I think, political times. It's not just the fact that women are impacted by international conflict more. The proportion of women killed in armed conflict in 2023 doubled, as did sexual violence against women as well. There is an increase in violence against women, and women are often at the sharper edge of conflict. We just need to look at Gaza to see the impact of that. Women and children were deeply affected. But actually, this is an evidence-based initiative as well. I'm going to just give you a couple of stats here that, international research suggests that countries with greater gender equality are more likely to resolve conflicts without violence, and women's participation in peace negotiations increases the probability of of a peace and a lasting agreement of peace. There's evidence to suggest that the probability of peace agreement lasting 15 years increases by 35%. It reminded me years ago when I was working in a hotel up the West Coast, and I had a friend from Northern Ireland, and we talked about the kind of the troubles. This was before the kind of peace deal, and I asked him, what would help, and he says, let the women take control, let the women come in charge, in an attempt to resolve those issues. But the evidence suggests that the more women involved in peace negotiations, we are more likely to build lasting peace. I don't want to be particularly gendered, but if you look at the kind of COVID impact, for instance, and you look at kind of the women in charge in New Zealand and the retainment of rights that happened in there, and then you compare that to Hungary with Orban, that used the COVID restrictions as a way of deepening social injustice and removing human rights. You've got these kind of two very different approaches. But yes, I think it's a great initiative. I wish we could do more. I wish that internationally we would do more, not just in Scotland, but across the board. Women are at the front, therefore women have to be at the front of peace as well.
Yes, yeah. And you touched on that in Gaza. I would like to see the numbers. According to the report, 12,316 women killed in Gaza and throughout the war, this particular war we are talking about. And I would like to go to Joyce. Are you okay now?
Yes, sorry.
Yeah. Yeah. Would you like to comment on a particular thing which we were women in conflict and the Scottish government's announcement?
Yes, well, obviously what the Scottish government can do in international affairs is modest, and it's restricted by money and the sort of responsibilities that the Scottish government has and doesn't have. But yes, obviously anyone would strongly support. That's a very, very positive initiative. I think. I don't know. I think, as in a lot of areas at the moment, we're needing to sort of regroup in a lot of areas where we've been able to be a little bit complacent. And when I say we now, I mean people, broadly speaking, in the Western countries, in Western democracies. We've been a little bit complacent in recent years. We were complacent about security because we've had 80 years of peace, and we've been able to take that sort of transatlantic alliance for granted. And even people who were strongly opposed to many of the things that NATO and the United States and the transatlantic alliance did came to take for granted the sort of peace, at least in our part of the globe, that delivered. And likewise, I think, when it comes to the progress of women in society, which has been really remarkable over the last 50 or 60 years, again, we've become complacent. And now we can see this horrific backlash, not only the election of a president who's quite explicitly opposed to women's bodily autonomy and has unleashed, an attack on women's rights, women's abortion rights right across the United States, which is now beginning to extend into areas like contraception. As well, we see the rise of influencers like the dreadful Andrew Tate, who are encouraging a whole new generation of young boys via the internet to take the most appalling attitudes to women, to dehumanize them, to legitimize violence against them. So this backlash is very severe. And of course, any resort to violence and war tends to restore a kind of male dominance, at least temporarily, in society. Because, it's sort of send the women back home, we're fighting a war now, this is serious men's business, go away. And you could see, that although there were a few women present in that scene in the Oval Office, you could see that as a really... It's a display of the kind of toxic masculinity that at this stage of human history we should be able to laugh to scorn, but we can't, because men like that are still in power and are still being validated and upheld, not only by lots of other men, but sadly by some women too. So, the problem with that kind of boys' game attitude to life, to humanity, to human life, to war and peace, has not gone away and is now once again in this cycle of history getting worse. And the only answer to that is for women and for everyone who wants to ally themselves with women on these issues to organise. We need to reorganise again, and we need to start making international links. We need to support our sisters in Afghanistan, who have suffered one of the worst systematic abuses of human rights I think the world has ever seen over the last few years. Total deprivation of any right to take part in society, even to be educated, is an absolutely scandalous situation in Afghanistan. And so, the only answer to that is for women and their allies to really organise themselves and to say, we're not having this, we are not going back. And of course, you can see women in the United States trying to begin to do that, but I think they're still in shock at the speed with which Roe v. Wade and their basic rights have been reversed. And people need time, really, to adjust to such a shock in a historic situation where we don't have much time. But we have to do it. And just as Europe now has to organise itself and to somehow defend itself without being able to rely on the US, women have to reorganise themselves and not assume that their progress can't be taken away from them again.
Thank you. It's a topic we can talk forever, but we have to move on to the next one. We will have the women's rights, the human rights and women's rights intertwined, like that kind of slogan, and we are going to discuss that later. But I'd like to discuss the social security budget cuts now. As Scottish Government announced that all devolved benefits will be increased by 1.7% in April. It was reported that the UK government is planning 6 billion social security cuts. Where will these cuts fall and who will be the most affected by them? Joyce?
Well, once again, as with the decision to cut foreign aid as a way of paying for defence, which just seems to me absolutely crazy, I'm baffled by this from a Labour government. I mean, how a Labour government can subscribe to the myth that British disability and sickness benefits are overgenerous just seems to me staggering. I mean, they're patently the worst in Western Europe, and everyone knows it, and everyone who's ever tried to apply for it or live on it knows it is not enough to live on, even if you can get it. And it's extremely difficult to get, and people describe horrifyingly stressful processes of trying to apply for it, particularly in situations where people have a chronic illness or problem which is not going to get better. You're in a situation where you've been diagnosed with something which is either terminal or chronic and is going to be life-changing for you for the rest of your life. And yet you're constantly harassed by people saying, oh, well, haven't you got better? Can't you go back to work now? And, expensive and laborious reassessments take place every couple of years, and people can't relax into their life and try and build something out of it. I mean, after all of those years of Tory austerity, you'd think the one thing the UK would have learned is that our people, not just our physical infrastructure, not just our energy infrastructure, not just things like the quality of, particularly in England, need investment. People need investment. People can't live creative, productive, the kind that this Labour government says it wants people to live and boost the economy and all the rest of it, if they are sick, if they are chronically insecure, if their mental health is being chucked under a bus the whole time by an economic system and a benefits system which doesn't support them. So why on earth to save what is essentially a petty sum in the UK budget of £5 to £6 billion, why they would launch this absolutely sadistic campaign against some of the most vulnerable people in our society, fronted by that awful minister who can produce no evidence that there's major fraud in the disability and sickness benefits system. She's not produced one shred of evidence that there are major savings to be made there, and yet she's doing it anyway. To please who? The people who write the headlines in the Daily Express? Is that what people voted for a Labour government for? I think it's a staggeringly dreadful decision. decision. And it's quite plain and quite obvious that the government can always find money when it's something they want to do, like investing in armaments, reinvesting in weaponry, building up the pockets of the arms industry. The whole of the European Union has just suddenly decided that the rules that it made about borrowing and so on don't need to be adhered to when it comes to weaponry, when it comes to defence. Now, it seems to me that having a healthy and functioning and strong population is at least as important for a nation's future as having a strong physical and military defence. And yet it's as if in order to, I don't know, stay in power, comply with the sort of general right-wing atmosphere of UK politics, even a Labour government has to talk this sadistic tripe about punishing people who are already in trouble in order to save what, in terms of a national budget, is basically a few pence. It's absolutely ridiculous. And I hope very large numbers of Labour MPs will oppose it. I can see that opposition already beginning to develop. People like John McDonnell are saying they will not back this. Ryan Leishman, the Scottish MP, has said he will not back this. And I really hope that there's a very large rebellion of Labour MPs to put a stop to this.
Siobhan, my question is, if borrowing, similar to what Joyce have said, if the borrowing rules can be relaxed for weapons, should they be relaxed to protect the poor?
I mean, it makes good financial sense to borrow to invest. So, if you look at the post-war Labour government, that's what they did. They borrowed to invest in our kind of and create public services such as free education, free healthcare, all those kind of things. So that borrowing to invest it makes good financial sense. Joyce loved that phrase, was it sadistic tripe? I absolutely feel I feel horrified at this Labour Party's decision. This comes actually just at the moment when the UN's Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights says that actually, instead of doing this, what they need to do is they need to correct the measures of austerity that the Conservative government come in. So, far from what they are doing the exact opposite of what the UN is asking them to do. Women are impacted by benefit cuts. Children are impacted by benefit cuts. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation says that 50% of people receiving a health-related benefit are either unable to heat their homes, they are behind on their bills, they have very low or very low food security compared to 11% of households not receiving universal credit or personal independent payments. This is an attack on the poorest parts of our society. And I think the word attack, and I say it absolutely with conviction, the thing we need to do in moments of crisis is we need to invest in communities. We need to protect our poorest. And that is not happening. This is an attack on our poorest. This is an attack on our children. And this is an attack on our women as well. It is shocking that we're now moving into austerity 2.0. This is not even austerity 2.0. This is a continuum of austerity. And that shift to the right is deeply worrying. And as Joyce said, there is no evidence for this. There is talk of an increase in disability benefits, but actually the research tells you that the reason there is an increase is because we increased the working age by basically delaying pension age, because the older we get, the sicker we get, and the more benefits we need. When you move the kind of pension age from 65 to 66, then 67 and beyond, then of course there will be an uptake on those working age, disability related and health related benefits. These are all fake arguments. However, the Labour Party are given what we would term as fake arguments. There is no, as Joyce said, there's no evidence of abuse of this. In fact, we would suggest that the uptake of some benefits are probably much lower than they should be. Dundee Council are actually being on an active mission to try and increase the amount of benefits that people are entitled to. And it's actually created a lot of income for our poorest members. So far from trying to push those benefits away, we should be encouraging people to take up those benefits, because that's what reduces poverty. The social security system in Scotland, I'm just going to finish in a bit, but the social security system in Scotland, things like the Scottish Child Payment, have shown to have significant impacts on lowering our child poverty levels. There is evidence that investment in a fair social security system will reduce poverty. But against that evidence, the Labour Party seek to punish and attack our poorest population. I am absolutely horrified at this move. I just cannot believe that a Labour government, of all things, would do this. And it shows you, I think, how far the Labour Party have shifted to the right in recent years.
I'll go back to Siobhan itself. You have touched it, but how does this affect the women more than the men? And the two child cap, and once I'll go to Siobhan first, and then I'll go back to Joyce, if that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, the Women's Budget Group said that disabled women are disproportionately affected by benefit cuts. Women make up the majority of benefit claimants and are more likely to have their benefits capped. So 60% of benefit capped households are led by women. So single parent households are more affected by benefit caps as well. So women are more likely to be disabled. They're more likely to lead the families. So those family-related benefit cuts that we've experienced, so the 2-child cap, those kind of cuts, those will always impact women disproportionately, because women as the centre of households tend to be, and also women leading families and so forth, but also women being more likely to have lower wages, more likely to be recipients of benefits. Every element of these benefit cuts will disproportionately affect women, and that will be the same if they focus in on disability related benefits as well. Women will always be disproportionately targeted in terms of all benefit cuts, or pretty much most of them. That's why the Scottish Child Payment is actually so important, because it's across the board, given to doesn't matter how many children you have, unlike the benefit cap. It doesn't matter how many children you have, you get that income no matter what. But what that's doing is staving off those benefit cuts. It's estimated that when the Scottish Government are removing that child benefit cap, an extra 15,000 children will be taken out of poverty, and 40-odd thousand children will actually benefit from that, actually taking them a little less out of the deeper poverty that women and children often experience.
Yeah, Joyce, would you like to add something into that?
No, I think Siobhan's obviously got huge expertise in this, and of course in her work as a counsellor, she will see it every day. It's just British benefits are not good. They're not high enough. It's a very miserable life trying to subsist on them, and to yes, indeed. Well, the Scottish benefit system helps with that, of course. But no, it's a miserable life. And to see a Labour government colluding with this lie that people can live the life of Riley on benefits is very, very sad.
If you don't mind, I'm just going to do a little bit of plug here, because I'm arranging a panel discussion at the STUC Congress on universalism and universal benefits, and because there is a kind of shift, I think a cultural shift away from kind of we should remove universalism and so forth. So there's a kind of I'm setting up a discussion in April at the STUC Congress to rethink that process and how universal benefits will impact on equality and our health, because poverty is always about health as well. And we have Chris Burt from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation as part of that discussion as well.
And poverty has got a direct relation to mental health as well, yes. And women's right, poverty and women's right and everything, all these interrelated. Shall we go into our next topic? At UN Women's Conference in Beijing in 1995, Hillary Clinton said, "Human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights. But where do we stand now? And are women's rights going forward or backwards?" Joyce?
Well, I think it's quite obvious that, as I said, just as we're having to rethink what we thought was kind of solid progress on kind of global
Yeah.
security and building a new world order after the Second World War, so we're having to rethink the progress that has been made on women's rights. We're seeing a horrible backlash, political backlash, a kind of media backlash, an online backlash, which is particularly worrying because of its influence on young people, and a great deal of misogyny. And obviously the continuing problem of violence against women. I mean, this week in the UK Parliament, we saw Jess Phillips reading out that list, which she does every year, of the women who have been killed by men, usually men well known to them, usually partners, or most often partners, or other men in their families or their immediate lives. Women who have been killed in the last year. I think this year the total in the UK was 95. And, you know, it seems that this epidemic, really, of interest in sort of, I don't know, a kind of culture of violence against women is, if anything, getting worse. And, you know, there are online movements like the incel movement, which actually advocate violence against women. And Andrew Tate, who Donald Trump has just in a high profile way managed to inveigle out of prison in Romania, where he should have remained, is clearly siding with men who advocate that kind of abuse of women, just as he's siding with bullies in, you know, in the larger geopolitics of the world. So this is a horror show. And as I said earlier, I think the only response to it is for women to get organised and stay organised and try to support one another in all of these situations. I mean, heaven knows I've thought as an individual, you know, I don't know exactly what I can do really to help the women of Afghanistan in the appalling situation that they're in now. My heart breaks for that whole generation of women and for the history of women in Afghanistan. You know, I saw a picture on the internet yesterday of women in Afghanistan graduating from a nursing college in 1930, you know, wearing modern dress, looking happy and confident and about to go out and serve in the world nearly 100 years ago. And now look where we are with them swathed in black from top to toe. You know, I can't believe that there is no mechanism in the world for challenging the men who are doing this, who are plainly insulting their own faith, insulting every decent standard of behaviour within their families. You know, they're absolutely not, you know, conforming to any legible moral rule at all. And yet here the world is just kind of accepting what they're doing to their women folk. And it just seems to me, you know, that nothing will shift this except organisation from the bottom up. Nothing ever does really, in the end, shift unless people at the grassroots somehow find the energy and the will to organise themselves and to protest and keep protesting. People of Georgia have now been protesting massive street demonstrations in every city in Georgia for 100 days against the manipulated election that brought their pro-Russian government back to power and has ended their kind of progress towards maybe one day joining the European Union. And the willpower that it takes to organise at that level over such a long period with absolutely no real immediate prospect of success is absolutely astonishing. But sometimes people can find that strength. And it just seems to me that we have to use all the tools that come to hand, all the mechanisms of the internet and everything else to try and build a movement of women that is both national and international here in Scotland, in the wider UK and Europe, and, you know, internationally, to try and support one another in this crisis and to rebuild what we are now in danger of losing, sadly.
Siobhan?
I mean, I hope you can indulge me in kind of giving you a wee personal story. I mean, I was politically active when I was younger and then kind of fell away, kind of just become less politically involved. But I took the decision back in 2010 or thereabouts, my son was only 2, that I would re-engage in politics. And I remember the decision very clearly for that was because I wanted to raise my son with the understanding that rights were not inevitable. Rights had to be fought for. They would be taken away if we didn't continue to fight them. And I wanted my son to learn that lesson. In a kind of bizarre way, I was nearly crying. I read his higher English essay, which was about homo Cllr, the rights of people or the removal of rights of people. And he basically ended and concluded by saying that rights must be fought for. And I thought, we've come full circle. I've taught him a very, very valuable lesson as a male and as a kind of friend of women, I think, as well. And I hope you can indulge me in that, because I think it comes back to kind of what Joyce was saying. We must keep up that fight. There are no rights that are sacred, and we've saw that erosion gradually, then absolutely whirlwind since Donald Trump come in, although increasing. Those rights have become absolutely stripped, and again, women are always at the centre of those removal. We are seeing an increase in fascism across the globe. We're seeing an export of fascism from the US. You saw what happened in Germany and the attempts to promote ADF across there. But one of the markers of fascism is, of course, an increase in misogyny. So these things are not disconnected. The removal of international aid from the US and from the UK has a gendered attack on women, because what it does, of course, is one of the things it does do is remove things like abortion rights, reproductive counselling, all those elements that will impact women will now be removed from international aid. So there are lots of rights that are being lost and stripped and attacked. And the word attacked comes in again, because this is a moment of deep attack on all our rights, including women's rights. And I want to just kind of, Amnesty International Secretary Agnes Callamard had said, we are now going backwards in terms of our women's right. The aggressive patriarchal crusade led by Donald Trump and other powerful leaders against the rights and the bodily autonomy of women and gender diverse people have already had devastating consequences, not just in the United States, but all over the world. We have dismantling the efforts to tackle gender-based violence, ending international funding for abortion counselling or referrals. The US administration is shamefully erasing years of hard-fought gains. This is deeper than Donald Trump. The international ramifications of this is absolutely huge. And again, we've shifted the political terrain so far in the last even month or so in terms of women's rights. I absolutely agree with Joyce. How we organise now will absolutely be vital in terms of protecting our rights, but that fight must be had.
Yep. I have got 2 more minutes. Joyce, would you like to add anything more into that?
No, I think it's except that in this situation, people who are engaged in politics can very easily become exhausted and despairing. The forces, and particularly the huge financial resources behind this kind of rightward shift in our politics. And one aspect of it we haven't mentioned, of course, is the absolute refusal to take seriously the threat of climate change, which again bears very heavily on women when they are trying to cope and to keep domestic life together and feed their families and so on, in a situation where climate and crops and so on are becoming more and more and more unreliable because of climate change. And yet we have this sort of toxic hegemony there, which just says, look, there's no problem. Climate change is a hoax, and we're not going to do anything about it. In fact, we're going to chop down a forest the size of California so that we can spite Canada and ruin our relations with them. That was Donald Trump's latest word on ecocide. So there's all of that as well. So it just seems to me that it's very easy to despair in this situation, but it's important not to. It's important to really value the good things that we still have. And that's something that people on the left sometimes find difficult, because our standard mode is, everything's wrong, we have to change it, we make it better. But learning to be grateful for and to value the good things that previous generations were able to pass on to us, to cherish them and to enjoy enjoy them in the moments when we're not working or campaigning. And that will give us strength to organise and campaign better. We have to get that balance right in our own lives, or we just won't get through this.
I think as well, if you kind of don't mind me coming in, but I think something that Joyce had said earlier on, events are happening so fast. The terrain is changing so fast that we barely have language to articulate what is actually going on. So it's, in a sense, it's like we're almost trying to catch our breath. So we've barely got time to articulate those events. So we're almost feeling like we're playing catch up continuously. And I think that's what Joyce has said, to a certain extent, that's where sometimes the despair and exhaustion can often come in, because sometimes we can become very immobilized because we don't even have the language to articulate that speed and pace and extremity of the events that are happening. So it's kind of that element of trying to play catch up here. But that will, I'm hopeful that we will eventually articulate those events clearly. We will set our goals clearly as well. And hopefully that's where the fight will begin.
Yeah, thank you. And well, that's for this week's full breakfast. Before I go, Scottish breakfast. Before I go, full Scottish. Sorry, sorry, it's my mistake. Sorry, and I'll go once more so that I can wind up properly. Well, that's it for this week's full Scottish. Before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on generosity of our supporters. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. And we were 16K short of our funding requirement in 2024, which has left us short of the money we need to pay our bills. We face costs of over 4,000 every month, but only receive donations of around 2,500. We have raised over 7,000 this year. So far by, we still urgently need to raise at least 5,000 to pay our bills now. Our programs will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 per month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, and please donate whatever you can afford. Thank you. Thank you to the viewers, and thank you, Siobhan and Joyce. Again, thank you for coming and having such wonderful discussion. Hopefully to see you soon again. Thank you so much.
Thank you.